What would you do if the woman scrubbing floors in your office turned out to be the only person who could save your $200 million deal while secretly holding the power to bring down your entire company? My God! How can this be happening now? Julian Carter's voice boomed through the 45th floor of Wellington Industries, the tension thick enough to slice with a letter opener. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble as he paced inside his glass-walled office, staring down at the street below. 3 black executive cars had just pulled up to the front entrance. Out stepped 5 members of the Chinese delegation, the top brass of the largest tech company in Asia. Men and women who held the fate of a $200 million deal in their hands. And now, no translator. "Rebecca," Julian barked, nearly slamming his phone down. "Tell me this isn't real." Sharon Blake, his longtime executive assistant, stood in the doorway, still holding her own phone to her ear. Her lips were tight, her voice strained. "She's not coming, Julian," Sharon said. "The interpreter just had a family emergency. She's stuck at the airport in Chicago. I've tried every backup in the city. No one's available." Julian yanked off his tie, sweat forming along his hairline. 20 years building Wellington Industries, and everything might collapse because of a damn language barrier. "You know how this works," he muttered. "They don't do casual. No apps, no improv. If we blow the first impression, it's over." "They're already heading to the elevator," Sharon said, checking her watch. Julian turned to the window again. The weight of 2 decades, the sleepless nights, the early mornings, the sacrifice pressed down on his shoulders. That's when a quiet voice broke through the chaos. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter, but I speak Mandarin." Julian turned, startled. So did Sharon. In the corner of the room, holding a cleaning cloth and a spray bottle, stood Ava Carter, 28 years old, dressed in the standard navy blue janitorial uniform. She had been wiping down the conference room table when the storm rolled in. Now she stood still, poised but not timid. Her voice was soft but clear. Julian blinked. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I said, I speak Mandarin and Cantonese and a bit of Taiwanese." Sharon let out a short, dry laugh. "Jasmine, sorry, Ava, that's sweet, really. But this is not the time." "I studied Oriental linguistics at Howard University," Ava continued, undeterred. "Before I took this job 3 years ago." The room fell into stunned silence. Julian studied her as if seeing her for the first time. The posture, the calm, the direct eye contact, she wasn't joking. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't flustered. Sharon shook her head. "You can't be serious, Julian. She cleans toilets. This isn't a karaoke night, it's a $200 million negotiation." But Julian was desperate and curious. He stepped closer. "Say something in Mandarin." Ava nodded and spoke, her tone respectful but confident. 欢迎您来到惠灵顿工业。我们非常期待与您合作，并希望我们的合作能够带来合理的成果。Julian didn't understand a word, but he didn't have to. It was the flow, the rhythm, the clarity. She sounded like someone born and raised in Beijing, not Brooklyn. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "I said, welcome to Wellington Industries. We are honored to work with you and hope our partnership will bring mutual benefit." A proper, formal greeting, exactly what was expected in Chinese business culture. Julian looked at Sharon, whose face had tightened. "This is insane," she hissed. "Do you know what it'll look like if we bring a janitor to the table?" Julian ignored her. He turned back to Ava. "You've got 20 minutes, he said. "Find something appropriate to wear. Meet me in the boardroom." Sharon gaped. "Julian, it's either her or we lose the deal before we open our mouths." Ava gave a small nod and turned to leave. As she disappeared down the hall, Sharon leaned in close, her voice low and angry. "You've completely lost your mind." But Julian wasn't listening. He stood by the window, watching the delegation approach. What Sharon didn't understand, what most people never notice, was the quiet power that comes from being invisible. For 3 years, Ava had walked the halls of the 45th floor. She knew which executives were honest and which ones were frauds. She'd cleaned conference rooms where billion-dollar decisions were whispered under breath. She'd watched, listened, and learned while they pretended she wasn't even there. Julian didn't know why he trusted her, but he did. And deep down, something told him. This might be the best decision he had made in years. 20 minutes. That's all Ava Carter had. She raced down the back stairwell from the 45th floor, heart pounding louder than her footsteps. Her hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from something else entirely. A sense that everything she'd been quietly waiting for was finally beginning. Downstairs in the staff locker room, Ava rifled through her small gym bag and pulled out the one decent outfit she owned that wasn't a uniform. Black slacks, a modest blouse, low heels. She had bought them 2 years ago at a thrift store just in case the world ever gave her 5 minutes to prove she was more than a cleaning badge. And nowhere it was. She caught her reflection in the scratched mirror. Her eyes were sharp, her jaw steady. Ava didn't see a janitor. She saw the young woman who once stood at the top of her linguistics class at Howard, the daughter who gave up everything when her mother's diabetes got worse, the quiet observer who had memorized executive strategy meetings while scrubbing their tables. She pulled her hair back into a neat bun. She was ready. Upstairs, the air in the boardroom was electric. 5 impeccably dressed executives from the Chinese delegation stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, chatting among themselves in Mandarin and admiring the Manhattan skyline. Julian Carter stood at the head of the polished glass table, doing everything he could to project confidence. But inside, he was counting every second, praying he hadn't made a colossal mistake. Then the door opened, and the room fell silent. Ava stepped in composed, professional, carrying a simple notepad like any other executive. Thomas Whitmore, the CFO, blinked twice.
"Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath. "Is that really her?" Sharon Blake didn't even try to lower her voice. "You can polish a lump of coal," she whispered to Danielle Brooks beside her, "but it's still coal inside." Julian ignored them.
"This is Ava Carter," he said, his tone deliberate, strong. "Our international relations specialist for the Asian market." A slight pause. Then Mr. Chen, the lead delegate, stepped forward and gave a respectful bow. Ava returned the gesture, then spoke in flawless Mandarin, thanking him for the honor of meeting and complimenting their punctuality, a trait deeply respected in Chinese business culture. Mr. Chen's eyes lit up, his posture relaxed. The tension in the room melted just a little. For the next 15 minutes, Ava translated with surgical precision. Not just the words, but the tone, the nuance, the rhythm of diplomacy. She knew when to soften a phrase, when to add warmth, when to emphasize respect. She even translated a quiet joke from one of the Chinese delegates that made the room laugh. Julian watched in stunned admiration. This wasn't someone improvising. This was someone who had prepared for this moment her entire life. Then, Sharon couldn't help herself. With a venomous smile, she leaned forward.
"Ava," she said loudly, "perhaps we should explain to our guests your unique career path within the company."
Julian shot her a warning glare. Sharon pressed on. "It's just so inspiring," she added, her tone drenched in sarcasm. "To see someone reinvent themselves like that, from cleaning bathrooms to negotiating international contracts." Ava froze for a fraction of a second. Not from shock, but calculation. Because she had heard this tone before, many times. 6 months ago, in fact, she'd walked into the executive bathroom and found Sharon crying on the phone. She hadn't made a sound, just cleaned quietly, but she remembered every word. "That black girl keeps lingering outside the boardroom like she belongs there." Ava hadn't reacted then. She had stored it just like everything else. Now, she smiled calmly and replied in Mandarin for Mr. Chen to hear, "Life teaches us
that opportunity often arrives in unexpected ways. Then, still in Mandarin, she added, "True capability should be judged by action, not appearance." The Chinese delegates nodded, clearly intrigued by her poise.
But the damage had been done. Ava could sense it. In Chinese culture, hierarchy matters deeply, and while her language skills impressed them, the fact that she hadn't been introduced from the start as a lead negotiator created confusion. She had become a curiosity, not an equal. The air shifted, the warmth cooled. Ava kept translating, but she could feel it in their glances. Something had cracked. After the meeting, Mr. Chen bowed politely and thanked Julian. "We will consider your proposal," he said in English, the diplomatic code for "we're not so sure anymore." As the delegation exited, Sharon crossed her arms with smug satisfaction. "Well," she said, arranging her notes with exaggerated flair, "that was interesting." Julian clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. But before he could speak, Ava stood. "Mr. Carter," she said gently. "Mr. Chen asked something before he left." Sharon turned. "Oh, really? What's that?" Ava paused. He was confused about the power dynamics in the room. He asked why the person speaking his language wasn't introduced as the primary negotiator. In their culture, the speaker holds authority. She let the silence stretch, then added, "He also asked to speak with me privately about future collaboration." Sharon's expression faltered for the first time. Julian said nothing. But in that moment, Ava knew. She had shifted something. Not just in the room, but in the foundation of how they saw her. That night, in her modest Brooklyn apartment, Ava sat on the edge of her bed. She had failed to secure the contract for now, but she had succeeded at something much greater. She had forced the room to see her, not as a cleaning lady, not as background noise, but as someone who could stand at the table. She opened her laptop. The file was labeled Wellington Industries, Irregularities. 63 pages. 3 years of listening. 3 years of watching. 3 years of being invisible and documenting everything. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. The rain was coming down hard in Brooklyn that night, tapping against the window like an anxious heartbeat. Ava Carter sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, the bluish glow reflecting off the wall of faded family photos. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional passing car down below. But in Ava's world, the silence was electric. She opened a folder on her desktop titled Wellington Industries, Irregularities, 63 pages, dozens of screenshots, audio files, confidential emails, spreadsheets, photographs, 3 years of silent observation, 3 years of people talking around her like she didn't exist. And Ava? She had listened, she had watched. She had remembered. It had started small, a casual remark here, a careless slip of a name there. Sharon Blake, printing confidential documents and leaving them face up on the copier. Charles Whitmore, the CFO, making shady jokes about pushing out the diversity hires. Sharon taking credit for work. Ava overheard being done by younger staffers who were mysteriously laid off weeks later. She wasn't spying, she was surviving. And when you're invisible, people assume you're harmless. Powerless. Furniture, but furniture has ears and eyes and memory. Ava clicked through the files, organizing everything. She wasn't just documenting petty office gossip. These were violations, serious ones, bid rigging, misuse of confidential data, internal communications that showed blatant racial bias in promotions. One file even included a recorded phone call between Sharon and a vendor where she instructed him to increase pricing for a black-owned subcontractor under the guise of budget constraints. Ava didn't need revenge. She needed truth, and now she had it. The next morning, Ava woke up early. It was still dark outside when she slipped into a clean blazer own she had bought with the advance Mr. Chen's team had given her and walked to Cafe Mandarin on 42nd Street. Mr. Chen was already there, seated in the corner, sipping oolong tea. Beside him was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, dressed in a pale grey pantsuit. "This is Grace Howard, Mr. Chen said warmly. "Our Vice President of International Development." Ava shook her hand, firm. "Professional. No trace of condescension." "We're expanding our footprint in North America," Grace said. "And we're looking for someone who understands both Chinese cultural nuance and American business politics." Mr. Chen added, "We need someone who has watched how business works from the inside, someone who knows what really happens behind glass doors." Ava didn't speak immediately. Then, with calm precision, she slid a slim USB drive across the table. "What's this?" Grace asked. "Proof," Ava said softly, "of why your instincts were right not to trust Wellington Industries." They plugged it in. As the files opened, Ava explained, not bitterly, but factually, what she had seen, what she had heard, what she had documented. They didn't interrupt. They read, listened, took notes. After an hour, Grace leaned back, visibly shaken. "These aren't just ethics violations," she said. "Some of this breaches federal trade laws, Mr. Chen nodded slowly. "This could spark a federal investigation." Ava met his gaze. "That's not my goal. I didn't start documenting this for revenge. I did it because one day I knew someone might finally ask the right question." Grace smiled faintly. "You're more than a linguist, Ava." Mr. Chen reached into his briefcase and handed her a card. It read, "Parker Associates, International Consulting. Lead Strategic Advisor, Ava Carter. Consider it," he said. "The role comes with a 6-figure salary, full discretion, and one condition." Ava raised an eyebrow. "We'd like you to begin by helping us assess Wellington's contracts from the inside as part of your transition out. A strategic alliance and a silent takedown." That afternoon, Ava returned to Wellington Industries. Back in her navy blue janitorial uniform, back behind the cart she had pushed for 3 years, but this time she wasn't cleaning. She was observing. She passed Sharon in the hallway, who loud enough for the whole department to hear sneered, "Well, look who's back where she belongs." Danielle Brooks laughed beside her. "After that pathetic little meeting, at least we know the pecking order again." Ava didn't react. Her hands moved over the surfaces automatically, wiping, polishing, straightening. But her mind? Laser-focused. 3 years of whispered hallway deals, printed documents left out in the open, phones left unlocked during coffee runs. They had all led to this. She paused by Sharon's office. The drawer wasn't even locked. Ava had memorized every folder inside, especially the one marked Vendor Adjustments, Non-Priority Markets, a euphemism Sharon used for minority-owned companies. That night, Ava uploaded the last piece of evidence. She encrypted it, saved 3 copies, then deleted the local file. Tomorrow, she would walk into the boardroom not as a cleaning lady, but as the person who held every secret this company tried to bury. And this time, when they looked at her, they wouldn't be able to look away. The boardroom of Wellington Industries had never felt colder. Even with morning sunlight spilling across the polished glass table and the skyline of Manhattan glittering beyond the windows, the tension in the room was like a storm cloud pressing down. Julian Carter stood at the head of the table, eyes hard, jaw tight. 8 senior executives sat before him, each shifting nervously in their leather chairs. The night before, he had received the email. Subject line, "Urgent formal notice of concern. International contract irregularities." It came from Mr. Chen, delivered with all the grace of a diplomat and all the weight of a grenade. The Chinese delegation, After reviewing documentation Ava had quietly provided during their private meeting, had filed an official complaint. The language was careful, but the implication was clear. We have discovered inconsistencies that may constitute violations of international trade ethics and federal regulatory standards. Translation: Wellington Industries was under scrutiny. Serious scrutiny. And Julian knew exactly where this was going. Sharon Blake arrived late. Not rushed, confident. She wore a scarlet power suit and heels that clicked like gunfire down the hallway. As she stepped into the boardroom, her chin lifted in defiance. "Well," she said breezily, dropping her sleek leather folder onto the table. "I assume we're here to discuss yesterday's fiasco." A few executives glanced at one another. "I warned you," Sharon continued, her voice cool. "Letting an unqualified cleaning lady handle a multi-million-dollar negotiation. It was reckless, embarrassing. And now it's costing us $200 million. She leaned back in her chair, as if awaiting applause. That's when the door opened again, and Ava Carter walked in, not in a uniform, not behind a janitor's cart, but in a tailored grey suit, hair pinned neatly, a leather briefcase in hand. She walked with quiet confidence and took a seat directly next to Juliana's if she belonged there. Because now, she did. Sharon blinked. "With all due respect, Julian," she said, her tone tight, "this is a board-level meeting." "She's here," Julian replied evenly, "because the Chinese delegation requested her presence to clarify their concerns." Sharon's smile faltered. Ava opened her briefcase, pulled out her laptop, and connected it to the projector. The screen came alive with documents, timestamps, and internal emails. "I met privately with Mr. Chen yesterday," Ava said calmly. "He asked for clarification on why someone fluent in Mandarin and familiar with Chinese business etiquette was not introduced as the lead negotiator." Sharon scoffed. "Because you're not." Ava didn't flinch. "What followed," she continued, "was a discussion about trust, about transparency, about integrity." She clicked. Up popped the first document, an email from Sharon to a client, dated 6 months ago, containing confidential details about a competitor's pricing model. The room fell silent. Julian's eyes darkened. Sharon stiffened. "That's out of context." Click. The next slide showed an altered cost sheet. Projects led by Black and Latino employees had been intentionally inflated, causing them to be cancelled for appearing unprofitable. "I overheard the conversation," Ava said softly. "But more importantly, I have the digital trail." Sharon stood up, fists clenched. "This is a setup." She's just a cleaning lady with a grudge." Ava met her gaze with unshakable calm. "I'm exactly what I've always been," she said. "Someone who listens, who observes, who documents." She clicked again. Now a recorded audio clip played from the boardroom speakers. Sharon's voice filled the room. "We can't let these kinds of people think they belong in executive meetings. It's about preserving our image." Sharon's face drained of color. Charles Whitmore, the CFO, glanced down at the table. Danielle Brooks bit her lip. Across the room, Richard Collier, 60-year-old black director who had spent decades in the company, leaned forward. "Sharon," he said quietly, "is this your voice?" Sharon's lip trembled. "That was privet. It was never meant." "It doesn't matter what you meant," Ava replied. "It matters what you did." Julian stood. "Sharon Blake," he said, his voice like steel. "You have 30 seconds to explain why you should not be terminated for cause and reported to the federal authorities." Sharon looked around the room, searching for an ally. "Anyone?" She found only silence. "You're making a mistake," she whispered. "No," Ava said gently. "You did when you assumed silence meant weakness." Julian nodded to security. "Your access is revoked immediately. You'll be escorted out." As the guards approached, Sharon looked at Ava one last time, eyes burning with hatred. "You may have won today," she hissed.
but you'll always be what you are. Ava smiled faintly. You're right, she said. I'm someone who listens, learns, and acts when the moment is right. The doors closed behind Sharon, and just like that, 15 years of privilege collapsed in under 5 minutes. 3 hours later, the board reconvened. This time, Ava stood at the front. Julian turned to the room. Effective immediately, he announced. Ava Carter is appointed Director of International Relations. No applause, just stunned silence. A woman who once wiped down their tables now held the power to reshape their global future. Ava looked out at the city beyond the windows, the same skyline she used to admire while mopping floors. Only this time, she was no longer invisible. She was the one writing the future. 6 months had passed. But if you walked into the 45th floor of Wellington Industries today, you might think you had entered an entirely different universe. The energy had changed, the culture had shifted, and at the center of it all was Ava Carter. Gone was the invisible cleaning lady who once moved silently between offices. In her place stood a woman in a crisp navy suit, leading international negotiations, commanding boardrooms, and walking past her old card like it belonged to someone from another lifetime. Her glass-walled office now sat directly across from Julian Carter's. Floor-to-ceiling views of Manhattan. Custom bookshelf. A small frame on her desk held a photo of her and her mother on Ava's graduation day from Howard, one of the few moments of peace before everything fell apart. And now, everything had come full circle. Miss Carter, said Jennifer, her new personal assistant, once a junior in accounting. The South Korean delegation is in the lobby. They said they're excited to meet the woman who tripled our business in Asia. Ava smiled, smoothing her blazer. Tell them I'll be down in 5. She wasn't just being polite. She had earned the right to take her time. In just half a year, Ava had renegotiated existing partnerships, repaired the company's damaged relationship with the Chinese delegation, and secured $400 million in new cross-border contracts. Wellington Industries was no longer struggling for relevance overseas. It was leading the way. Julian Carter, once skeptical, now fiercely supportive, often said in meetings, promoting Ava was the smartest decision I've ever made. Behind closed doors, he admitted something even more honest. She saved this company from its own arrogance. But Ava's victories weren't just professional. They were personal. Her new 6-figure salary had allowed her mother, Angela Carter, to receive top-tier treatment for her diabetes. No more crowded clinics, no more delayed medications. Angela now lived in a comfortable apartment near the river, where sunlight streamed through the windows and a nurse visited twice a week. Most nights, Ava called her just to say, "Mom, we made it." And every time her mother replied the same way, "You made it, baby. I just held the umbrella when it rained." Despite her success, Ava hadn't forgotten where she came from. In fact, she made sure no one else forgot either. That spring, she returned to Howard University not as a student, but as a guest of honor. She stood on stage in a packed auditorium of 500 students and announced the launch of the Second Chance Scholarship Program. Funded in part by her own salary, the program would support low-income students who were forced to pause their education to care for family or work full-time just like she had. No one should have to choose between caring for their family and chasing their dreams, Ava told the crowd. Sometimes life doesn't give you a straight path, but that doesn't mean the destination is out of reach. The room erupted in applause. By the end of the month, 20 full scholarships had already been awarded. Back at Wellington Industries, Ava had become more than an executive. She had become a mentor. Each Friday, she held informal coffee chats with younger staff from departments that often got overlooked: operations, maintenance, security. She'd ask them 3 simple questions. What do you wish someone asked you during your first week? What are you capable of that no one's noticed yet? What can we do to help you grow? And they answered,
Because Ava didn't just look at resumes. She looked at people. She remembered what it felt like to be underestimated, ignored, passed over, and she made damn sure no one else felt that way under her watch. Meanwhile, Sharon Blake was nowhere near the 45th floor. Her once luxurious life in Midtown Manhattan had crumbled like a rotted foundation. After being fired and reported to federal authorities, she'd been slapped with a $50,000 personal fine and a 5-year ban from holding any executive role in companies with federal contracts. Her name had been published in every major business publication. Toxic leadership has a name, Sharon Blake. She applied for dozens of jobs, got rejected from all of them. The industry that once celebrated her now pretended she never existed. She rented a small apartment in Queens. The walls were thin, the light was dull, the silence was loud. One morning, while sipping instant coffee, she opened her laptop and saw Ava's photo on the cover of Business Week. The translator who revolutionized global business. The image hit her like a punch, not because Ava had won, but because deep down, Sharon finally realized she had lost something bigger than a title. She had lost who she could have been if she hadn't been so consumed by prejudice. For the first time in months, Sharon cried. And for the first time, it wasn't out of self-pity. It was out of regret. That evening, in her apartment on the Upper East Side, Ava looked out at the skyline, the same skyline she once admired through cleaning fluid and fingerprinted glass. Her phone buzzed. "Mom," she answered, smiling. "I saw your interview on TV today," Angela said. "You talked about dignity and second chances. You spoke so beautifully, honey." "I learned from the best," Ava said quietly. "You always told me they can try to make you feel small, but they can't take away what you know and who you are." As she hung up, Ava stood by her window a little longer. She knew the real victory wasn't just the title or the paycheck. It was the legacy she was building, one scholarship, one voice, one unseen employee at a time. The girl no one noticed had become the woman no one could ignore. Late one evening, Julian Carter knocked on the open door of Ava's office. The building was quiet. Most executives had gone home. But Ava, as usual, was still there, her sleeves rolled up, a contract half-reviewed, a cup of cold tea at her side. "You got a minute?" Julian asked. Ava looked up and smiled. "Of course." He stepped in, closed the door behind him, and sat across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said slowly. "Something that's been on my mind since the day Sharon walked out of that boardroom." Ava leaned back, waiting. Julian looked her in the eye. "You could have destroyed her." Ava didn't respond immediately. "I mean it," he continued. "You had the receipts, the recordings, the files. Everything. And yet, you only showed what was necessary to prove the misconduct. You didn't humiliate her. You didn't go for her throat." He paused. "Why?" Ava's smile was quiet, thoughtful. "I thought about it," she admitted. "Trust me, I did." Julian waited. "But then I remembered something my mother used to say," she went on. "Revenge might feel good for a moment, but building something better, that feels good for a lifetime." Julian nodded slowly. Ava continued. "Sharon expected me to be angry. She expected fire and fury. She wanted to point and say, 'See? She's bitter, she's emotional, she's out for blood.' But I didn't give her that, because I didn't need to destroy her." She looked out at the Manhattan skyline. "I just needed to show them who I was." What Sharon never understood, what so many like her refused to see, was that true power doesn't come from domination. It comes from restraint. From knowing you could strike, but choosing to build instead. Ava had all the ammunition in the world to ruin Sharon's life completely, but she didn't use it not because she was weak, but because she was wise. Because she knew that the higher ground isn't always the easiest path, but it's always the one that leaves you sleeping peacefully at night. Word had spread across the industry, not just about Ava's meteoric rise, or her record-breaking deals, or her scholarship foundation, but about how she handled it all, how she never gloated, never dragged anyone through the mud, never used her platform to humiliate those who once humiliated her. She led with dignity. And dignity, in a world obsessed with noise, had become a quiet superpower. Back in her apartment that night, Ava opened an old notebook, the same one she used during her early shifts at Wellington. Between pages of Mandarin practice and boardroom vocabulary, there were little scribbles in the margins. One day, I'll sit at the table. Don't fight small battles. Build a bigger world. Silence isn't weakness. It's preparation. She smiled, remembering how she used to write those notes while mopping floors just to keep hope alive. And now, she was living them. The next morning, she met with a young intern from operations named Malika Shai, first-generation college student. He was nervous, fidgeting with the corner of his notepad. "I just wanted to say, I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for your story," he said quietly.
It made me believe that maybe I don't have to be invisible forever. Ava looked at him and nodded slowly. "Malik," she said, "you were never invisible. People just weren't looking in the right direction." And with that, she handed him a small card with her initials and number. "Keep this," she said. "When it's your time to shine, make sure you pull someone else out of the shadows too." Every Friday morning at 8 a.m., the same thing happened on the 45th floor of Wellington Industries. While most departments were still half awake, a small group of young employees, some from operations, others from maintenance, IT, or customer support, would gather in the corner lounge with coffee cups and nervous smiles. At the center of it all, Ava Carter, Director of International Relations, sitting cross-legged on the couch like she wasn't one of the most powerful people in the building. These were her Friday morning mentorships. No camera crews, no HR initiatives, no publicity. Just a woman who remembered exactly what it felt like to be overlooked, sitting with people who still were. She began each session the same way. "I'm not here to fix you," she told them. "I'm here to remind you you were never broken." The interns and junior staffers came from everywhere: first-generation immigrants, single parents, former service workers, community college transfers. And for the first time in their lives, someone at the top was listening. Truly listening. They asked her questions they didn't dare ask anyone else. How do you speak up in a room where no one looks like you? How do you deal with people who treat you like you're lucky to even be in the building? What if I don't want to be a diversity hire? I want to be the best. Ava answered every question with brutal honesty and quiet grace. You don't owe anyone your silence just to make them comfortable, she said. And being excellent, that's not about outperforming others. It's about refusing to shrink yourself to fit their expectations. Word spread, not through corporate memos, but through whispers, hallway conversations, and late-night texts that said, "She saw me. She gave me a chance. She didn't just break the ceiling, she's building stairs." By spring, Ava's Friday morning circle had grown from 5 people to nearly 50, not just from Wellington, but from other companies too. Young professionals across the city asked to join. She turned no one away. One Friday, a soft-spoken woman named Tashan, IT assistant from another firm, choked up as she spoke. "I was told not to speak too loudly in meetings, that I come off as too aggressive." Ava nodded slowly. "They tell us that confidence is threatening, that ambition is arrogance, but what they really mean is, don't make us uncomfortable by knowing your worth." Then she looked at the whole room. "Know it anyway." The crowd fell silent, then applauded. Julian Carter watched all of this from a distance. The board meetings, the leadership reports, the soaring profits, they were impressive. But this, what Ava was building quietly each week,
It was something deeper. Something permanent. She's not just mentoring, he told Richard Cole, the company's senior black director. She's leading a movement. Richard smiled. And she's doing it the same way she did everything else, he said, without asking for permission. That summer, Ava launched a pilot program called Shadow to Strategy. It paired junior support staff with senior executives for 30-day immersion projects. Not internships. Not side observations. Real responsibilities. Real deliverables. Some in the executive team raised their eyebrows. This isn't how mentorship usually works, one VP said. To which Ava replied, exactly. By the end of the quarter, 2 participants from the pilot had been promoted. 3 had been recruited to join international strategy teams. More importantly, they started showing up to meetings differently. Straighter posture, fuller voices, eye contact that said, I belong here, because someone finally told them they did, and showed them how to believe it for themselves. One evening, as Ava packed up her things, a new intern named Zaya knocked gently on her door. He looked no older than 20, nervous, but focused. Miss Carter, he said.
You've created something powerful here, she smiled. I didn't create it. I just made space for it. He nodded.
Still, thank you. You changed how I see myself. Ava paused, then handed him the same card she had given Malik months earlier. Good, she said. Now go change how someone else sees themselves. That's how we keep this going. He took the card with both hands, and just like that, the movement grew again. When Forbes released their annual Top 30 Business Visionaries Under 40 issue, it was Ava Carter's face that appeared on the cover. Not a celebrity CEO, not a tech billionaire. A woman who used to clean the boardroom floor she now ran. In the photo, she stood beside a delegation of Chinese and South Korean business leaders, all smiling, arms crossed, equal partners. The headline read, From Janitor to Global Power Broker, Ava Carter's Unstoppable Rise. The reaction was instant. LinkedIn exploded. Wall Street took notice. Every business podcast wanted her story. Students at business schools across the country were quoting her in class, but Ava didn't post about it. She didn't tweet. She didn't host a press conference. Instead, she went to work, just like always. Inside Wellington Industries, something extraordinary had happened. People who once walked past her without eye contact were now stopping her in elevators to ask for insight. Young interns held their heads higher when they said her name aloud. Yeah, I work with Ava Carter's team, and even the most traditional, old-school board members had started using phrases like, what would Ava think of this approach? Has Ava reviewed the international compliance structure? She had become not just a leader, but the company's conscience. Meanwhile, Sharon Blake sat in her one-bedroom apartment in Queens, still jobless. She'd made the round-stride PR spin, begged for consulting work, even changed her name on applications. No one bit. The federal investigation had sealed her fate, and Ava's success had become the mirror she couldn't look away from. One night, she watched Ava's keynote speech at the International Women in Leadership Summit. The camera panned across a standing ovation as Ava finished her final line. You can't erase someone's worth by ignoring them, but you can lose everything by refusing to recognize it. Sharon turned off the laptop, tears welling. They weren't tears of jealousy anymore. They were something colder, regret. Back at Wellington, Julian Carter called a meeting with the executive board. The numbers were astounding. Since Ava had taken over as Director of International Relations, the company's international revenue had grown by 300%. But even more telling, employee satisfaction had jumped. Turnover was down. New talent was pouring in not because of flashy salaries, but because people wanted to work somewhere where people like Ava were allowed to lead. Richard Cole, the company's senior black director, stood up during the meeting and said, In my 40 years in corporate America, I've never seen a transformation this authentic. Ava didn't just change the numbers, she changed the culture. The room erupted in applause. Even Julian stood to clap.
Ava, sitting modestly at the side of the table, simply smiled, because she knew numbers fade, impact lasts. That evening, as Ava walked to her car, she was stopped by a young woman in the lobby. She couldn't have been more than 22, nervous.
Hopeful. Miss Carter, she asked.
Yes?
I just wanted to say, I was told I wasn't executive material, but then I read your story, and now I'm applying to the management program.
Ava reached into her bag, pulled out a small business card and handed it over. Good, she said.
Now prove them wrong. The girl's eyes sparkled, and in that moment, Ava saw herself not as she was now, but as she once had been. Invisible, undervalued, and utterly unstoppable. The applause was thunderous. Ava Carter stood on stage at Howard University, her alma mater, beneath the warm lights of Crampton Auditorium. Students, professors, alumni, and guests filled every seat. Some stood in the aisles. Others leaned against the walls. Everyone was there to witness something unprecedented. Today, Ava said, her voice steady, we're launching the Second Chance Foundation. Behind her, a screen displayed 20 young faces students who had once dropped out due to family or financial hardship. Now, thanks to Ava, they would return. This isn't charity, Ava continued. This is investment. In potential, in dreams, in people who were told they had to choose between survival and education. She paused. No one should ever have to make that choice. The crowd rose to their feet. Tears streamed down the faces of parents in the front row. Students clapped until their hands hurt. And in a small balcony seat, Ava's mother, Angela Carter, wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, her chest rising with pride. The Second Chance Foundation was funded by Ava's own salary, bonuses, and partnerships she personally negotiated, but it was more than a scholarship. It was a movement. Students didn't just receive tuition support, they received mentorship, job placement assistance, emotional counseling, and financial literacy workshops. Ava had designed the program to give them everything she never had when she dropped out. And she stayed involved, personally. Every month, she sat in on orientation sessions. She reviewed applications. She showed up to late-night study sessions just to say, keep going, you're seen. One evening, after speaking at a fundraiser, Ava sat in her car outside her mother's apartment. Angela had refused to move into a fancy condo uptown. I don't need a doorman, she had said. I just need my baby to be okay. Ava brought her groceries every weekend. They watched documentaries together, talked about books, laughed about the time Ava once mixed up Mandarin and Cantonese and accidentally told a CEO that his Thai looked delicious. This time, Ava handed her a small envelope. Open it, she said. Angela peeled it open and pulled out a letter. Her eyes scanned quickly, then widened. Columbia, she gasped. Executive Master's Program. Ava nodded. Full ride. I finished it last month. Angela covered her mouth. You went back? I never stopped learning, Ava said quietly. Now I just made it official. They hugged in the doorway. Mother and daughter. Survivors. Builders. Believers. In the weeks that followed, Ava received dozens of letters from students in the Second Chance program. One wrote, I used to mop floors and cry during my lunch break. Now I manage a team of 5. Another, you didn't just give me tuition, you gave me my dignity back. Ava kept every letter. She framed 3 of them on the wall of her office right, next to her Business Week cover, and the honorary plaque from the Chamber of Commerce. Because for her, that was the real resume. Not titles, not awards, but lives changed. One morning, Richard Cole stopped by her office.
He had a small box in his hands. "What's this?" Ava asked. He smiled. "A little something from the board." Inside was a custom-made nameplate for her door, not the standard gold, but wood dark, polished, engraved with a single line beneath her name. "The woman who built ladders." Ava stared at it, emotion catching in her throat. She thought about all the years no one said her name, all the rooms where no one looked her in the eye. Now, her name wasn't just on the door. It was opening doors for others. That afternoon, a reporter asked Ava if she had any regrets. She thought for a moment, then said, "No." Because every insult, every overlooked promotion, every late night spent cleaning up after people who never said thank you, it all taught me one thing. She looked straight into the camera. They can underestimate you. They can ignore you. But they can never erase your worth unless you let them. The sun had just risen over Manhattan, casting gold light across the steel and glass towers. Inside Wellington Industries, the executive boardroom buzzed with anticipation. Julian Carter, now CEO and chairman of the board, stood at the head of the table, facing a full room. Department heads, board members, and investors from 5 countries had flown in for this announcement, but all eyes were on the empty chair beside him. Then the door opened. Ava Carter walked in. No fanfare, no entourage. Just the quiet authority of a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to build. She wore a deep blue suit, a nod to her old janitorial uniform, tailored now with precision and pride. Her presence was magnetic. The room fell into respectful silence. Julian stepped aside. "This company was built on ambition," he began, but Ava Carter reminded us that ambition without humility is empty. That strategy without compassion is short-lived, and that the most powerful people in the room might not look like what we're used to. He turned to her. "And so today, it's my honor to introduce our new Chief Global Officer, Ava Carter." The applause was instant. Thunderous. Some stood. A few had tears in their eyes. Not just because of who she had become, but because of what she represented. Later that afternoon, Ava walked through the 45th floor quietly, not to celebrate, but to remember. She paused outside the janitor's closet. It was still there. Still small, still unremarkable, but she smiled. Because that room had witnessed the making of a strategist, of a survivor, of a leader who had once been invisible. She didn't erase the past. She carried it, like armor. That evening, at a gala honoring diversity in leadership, a reporter asked Ava, "If you could say one thing to the version of you from 3 years ago, the one pushing that cleaning cart, what would it be?" Ava looked into the camera and said without hesitation, "Don't let the silence fool you. It's not the end. It's the beginning." Across town, in a much smaller apartment, Sharon Blake sat on her couch, watching the interview online. Her world had shrunk. She lived alone. The industry had turned its back. The headlines had faded, but the consequences remained. As Ava's words echoed through her speakers, Sharon felt something unexpected. Not bitterness, not jealousy, but clarity. A dawning understanding that the person she once dismissed had become everything she herself had failed to be. Not just powerful, but worthy of that power. Sharon closed her laptop. For the first time, her tears weren't for herself. They were for what she had wasted. Back at Wellington, Ava sat in her new corner office, the city glowing beyond her window. Her phone buzzed. A text from one of the scholarship recipients. "Got the job, first in my family. Thank you." She smiled. Not because of what she had earned, but because of what she had passed on. She picked up a pen and began writing on the back of an old notepad she had kept from her days on the cleaning staff. She wrote, "True power doesn't shout, it listens. Leadership doesn't command, it lifts. And legacy isn't made in titles,
It's made in how many people rise with you. She folded the note and tucked it into a folder labeled The Next Ava Carter, because she knew there was someone, somewhere, walking silently through the halls of a company right now, unnoticed, undervalued, but watching, learning, waiting. And when their time came, they wouldn't just take the seat at the table, they'd build a bigger one. The story of Ava Carter is a powerful reminder that true worth isn't defined by titles or how loudly we speak, but by patience, quiet resilience, and the way we treat others when no one is watching. In a world that often praises ambition at any cost, Ava chose a different path, to rise with dignity, to build rather than destroy, and to lift others as she climbed. For older Americans, this story resonates deeply. It reminds us that wisdom isn't always loud, and success doesn't have to come fast. Sometimes the most powerful legacy we can leave behind isn't in what we accomplish for ourselves, but in how many lives we change by doing the right thing when it matters most. Ava's journey is proof that even when you're overlooked, underestimated, or invisible, your time will come if you stay ready, stay grounded, and lead with integrity.